Okay, just a second. Hello, welcome to today's event for the Diverse Perspectives in Digital Media and Design 2020 Speaker Series. To paraphrase James Baldwin, nothing can be changed until it is faced. And this is certainly true of the inequities that have historically shaped the digital media industry. This event is brought to you by UConn's Department of Digital Media and Design. We would like to begin today's event by acknowledging that the land which we typically gather here in Storrs, Connecticut is the territory of the Mohegan, Mantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Pagosset, Nipmuc, and Lenape peoples who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. Today's event will feature a presentation by our guest speaker, Deneva Goins, followed by a Q&A featuring questions from the virtual audience. Please take advantage of the YouTube chat box to submit any questions for our guest, which we'll try to answer during the discussion. So use that chat box. I'm Heather Elliott Familaro, and I'm the department head for digital media and design here at the University of Connecticut. We've got a young program founded in 2013 that's rapidly grown to over 350 undergraduate and graduate students and 25 full-time faculty. We have 7 undergraduate concentrations that range across the full digital media spectrum: film production, animation, interactivity, business, and the humanities at the Storrs and Stanford campuses. In our department, we value and celebrate our students' diverse backgrounds, and we support their development both as individuals and as professional media creators. The Diverse Perspectives in Digital Media and Design Speaker Series is a celebration of those shared values. Now, I'd like to introduce today's co-host, Professor Joel Salisbury, and DMD Web and Interactive Design student, Ariana Gomez. Joel is an assistant professor in our Web and Interactive Media Design concentration here at UConn DMD. In addition to being a self-proclaimed UX nerd, he's a web and application developer, a creative partner in a small digital strategy branding agency, and a founding director of our Digital Experience or DX Lab, which explores emerging technologies in UX and interaction design, app development, and digital problem solving. And I'm also happy to introduce our student co-host today, Ariana Gomez. Ariana is currently a junior in the Web and Interactive Design track here at DMD, and she works with both the communications and the provost departments here as a student webmaster specialist and a graphic designer. She is also the creator of her own small business, Graphics by Ari, which she creates and sells custom digital arts, video, logos, and more. And we'll put her website into the chat box so you can explore that as well. So, alas, let me turn over the virtual mic to Joel so you can finish off and enjoy this. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning, Deneva. So it is my pleasure to welcome Deneva today as our special guest speaker, presenting her perspectives on ethics, diversity, and inclusion in UX design. So Deneva is a 20-year veteran in the UX design world who has contributed her expertise across the globe, from startups to everything from startups to well-known companies such as Intel, Microsoft, Cisco, HP, and more. So a lot of perspective here. She's currently a staff UX designer at VMware, a global leader in cloud computing and virtualization. And Deneva has called Silicon Valley her home for the past 9 years. So she has been an excellent and very thorough representative of the UX world and has plenty of experience to offer. She's also a candid and outspoken advocate for social justice, particularly regarding race and gender. Deneva comes with a educational background of a BFA from Bowling Green State and an MA in interaction design from Utrecht in the Netherlands. Take it away, Deneva. Thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Hey, thank you for that wonderful introduction. So I guess I'm going to quickly do a presentation about a little bit about my background and some history about the exclusion in design as well as inclusion, how we've changed over the years. And I'll just go ahead and do that. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, you guys able to see my screen?
We can see it.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah, if you may want to go full screen on that. and then we can get to perfect.
Okay, so these are just a few places that I've been. So all the pink dots represent the places I've lived, and the blue dots are places I've visited. So I've been, I currently live in California. I'm in Mountain View. That's the home of Google, and there's a lot of companies here. New York, Ireland, Germany, and more. So just wanted to quickly show that. And Joel touched on some of the companies that I've worked for. So these are just a few. I'm currently at VMware. And HP, I was working there as in the augmented reality section, and at Intel Education, Cisco Telepresence, Microsoft, I worked on Bing, and more. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about basically the history of exclusion and why design is really, really important, and how we as designers change the world. I'm going to start with this. So before mid-19th century, we've had in England, in the pubs, okay, we're going to talk about bathrooms. We're going to talk about something that's universal that everyone has to do. It's a task that we all have to do. And how do we include people? How do we make sure that everyone can get that task done? User experience design is all about designing for that end user. Who is that? Where are they? What is their context? And at this particular time in history, bathrooms were completely separated because it was expected that women were to be staying at home. So there were no female bathrooms at all in the pubs. That didn't come up until much, much later. And so I think that that's something that's important to have that cultural context. And that's something that I have to think about every time when I'm designing. I'm designing for people around the world. My users are around the world. The people I work with are around the world. So we fast forward a little bit to 19th century. We've got ladies' bathrooms. Finally, women can leave the house to go shopping. So at some point, people were fighting to have the right to go to the bathroom because they couldn't leave the house because they weren't allowed to go to the bathroom. Very basic stuff. And this is signage. We're talking about signage. Signage is a key thing in UX design and user experience design, because we as designers are designing for people to interface with these systems. And those systems can be governments, they can be computers, they can be computers within the governments, et cetera, et cetera. So this is in Coney Island in New York in 1905. I'm showing examples of exclusion or the history of exclusion as it relates to design. So this is an example of a human zoo, and this is in Coney Island. These folks are from the Philippines. So historically, we've had this sort of perspective that the world centers around one perspective. And if you are a UX designer, we know that design centers around the end user who is going to use that system. And in this case, we have a clear differentiation between the system itself on the outside and the people that are on the inside. So this is an example of exclusion in design of our society, in our society. Exclusion by design. So here we have an example of some signage from 1929. This is in Texas, where, again, I started talking about bathrooms and exclusion and interfacing with systems. How are we designing how people interface with these systems? Who is included in these systems? Who are the users? Okay, so this is an example of signage that was from 1929, which clearly stated an exclusion of specific people. This is in Belgium, 1958. We've got a little girl here, also in a zoo. And we have the broader society, the broader systems on the outside. And we have this person who doesn't have a place to be included in the society, placed in this context. Fast forward back to bathrooms again. So here we are where we've got, now at least women have bathrooms, because we expect that women are going to be able to leave the house and go and do things. And the world is not only just for guys. And in this case, we are also including people of color, and that's in the United States. So we're kind of evolving our design to include people, as we move forward. So this is another signage from the Netherlands, just making it very clear who's allowed and who's not. So we as designers, we are the gatekeepers. We're the ones who provide the path for users to get done what they need to get done. So fast forward 2000, we have the bathrooms have now been desegregated. We've got women in the bathrooms, we've got men in the bathrooms, and I forgot to add the slide about allowing men with children and women with children in the bathrooms as well. And a lot of these designs echo what's going on in our social context, not just within the United States, but worldwide. Fast forward to 2016. So this was something that happened in my community. We were trying to do better bathrooms, and this was not the design that I wanted to use, but this was a design that was suggested. We're thinking about what is the task that the user has to do. They just go into the bathroom. If we focus on what the user is trying to accomplish, and we focus on what their context is, we come up with a slightly better design, but it can still be improved. So this one I think is the best design in terms of bathroom design, making it more inclusive. And this is just an example of how we've improved. And this is something that's slowly evolving, right? So we're still not there yet, but this is a very basic task. Where do you go to the bathroom? Who gets to go to the bathroom? Who gets to be, it's a very simple thing, but it's very contentious and very political and touches on all sorts of things, from gender to disability to race and so forth. So if we the next section that I want to talk about is really some real world examples of how technology specifically, because I use these interfaces that you're interfacing with the government. You as a user are interfacing with the government, but I wanted to show some examples of where technology is interfacing with the users. So, and this is an example in Microsoft, their chatbot, which they programmed this chatbot, right? And the chatbot was supposed to take input from the broader society and include it. And unfortunately, that just didn't work out the way it was expected to work out, because it again reflected what people were doing. So there's this tension between what the designers can do versus what people input and what kind of a world we want to create. So facial recognition is another example where user experience design and having a more inclusive approach and having a more inclusive staff could certainly have improved this. So for example, facial recognition, which is widely used on Facebook and other government and government agencies. So the way that the facial recognition works is centered around the people who designed it and not about the people who are using it. This is an example of a logo of a company that I actually worked with. Intel owned this company, they purchased it. And so this is an example of us not knowing, I don't want to say us because I wasn't there when this was designed, but not knowing what the end users are going to perceive this as. So we've got this evolution concept, and we've got, people evolving from an animal to a person, evolving from reading a paper book to having a tablet. And this was supposed to be for an educational application. We had an outcry from our users, and the outcry was, first of all, the #1 book that was selling there was the Bible, ebooks, digital books that were being delivered on this platform. So this was greatly offensive to a lot of our users. I hope I don't get in trouble for mentioning it. But anyway, I did want to bring that up as the importance of understanding the cultural context of the people that we're designing for, the customers that you have, and not only that, but the people, not just customers, everyone who will see it. The logo ended up changing to this. And of course, eventually when Intel bought it, it changes to the Intel logo. And one more example I have here is Shutterfly. I used to work at Shutterfly. Shutterfly sells invitations. So you can have photo books and memories and all sorts of wonderful things with your personalized information in there. And so one of the things that I had to work on was for weddings. When you design an invitation for a wedding, we're allowing people to design their own wedding invitations. And this was around the time when it became legal for same-sex marriages. So this was an example of where I felt like it was a big deal to just allow the bride, because these used to be just bride and groom. We changed the design to allow bride and bride and bride and groom. So that was a very big deal. We were the only company that did that at that time. Other companies, if you go in and try to design your own invitations, they would not allow something like that. So I just wanted to give an introduction and a brief sort of history of exclusion in design, as well as how design is becoming more inclusive and some real world examples of inclusion and exclusion by design, whether that design is interfacing with a system. The system could be the government, or it could be software, a voice interface, or other kinds of interfaces. So thank you. Back to Joel.
Thank you so much, Deneva. That's a great table setting, I think, for the discussion that I'd like to have. We have a number of students and faculty who have submitted a handful of questions, just discussion topics we'd like to cover. And I think we'll really spend a lot of time circling these topics and themes of inclusion and representation, both in our design work and in the design field. So Ari, if you want to start, please do.
Thank you so much. So the first question that we have for you is, what is UX design to you, and why is it important in your opinion?
So UX design to me is all about active listening. I feel like I'm an anthropologist. Right now I'm designing for people that I can't relate to at all. People who have lives that they live that I personally cannot relate to. So I really have to talk with them a lot, listen to them a lot, and really understand what matters to them. And I look at that from a human point of view before I start designing an interface, right? I want to know, we're not here to do our jobs. We're here to take care of our families, realistically. We're here to, care about our spouses and our children and so forth. And at the end of the day, every user who has a job, who has to use the system, has that as their center of their world. And these interfaces that we use are just a part of it. Did I answer that?
Yes, you did a wonderful job of answering that. The next question that we have for you is, what is the pinnacle of a great UX designer?
The pinnacle of a great UX designer is really someone who can design for people they can't relate to. So in the beginning of my career, I used to be able to sort of what I thought I was an intuitive designer. Like I could kind of feel out, oh, okay, this seems like it's natural. And what I learned over years is that there really is no such thing as intuitive design. It's really all about context and experience. What experience does that person have, and why does that interface feel intuitive? It feels intuitive because it's familiar. So I really, I approach design the way I approach drawing. It's all about observation, really being able to see. Perception is reality. Understanding that the people that I'm designing for, I may not understand how they feel. I may not understand where they're coming from, but I can build a story and put together personas to really understand, what their lives are like, what is important to them. That's the key to being a good UX designer.
That's
great.
great.
Thank you
Sounds
so
like
much.
empathy is key.
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the next questions that we have is, my classmate Bridget Sweeney had a question, and she wanted to know, how do you put yourself in the shoes of your potential consumers when working on UX? Do you interact with each project as yourself or someone else, or both?
So if it's something I can relate to, I will interact with it. If there's existing systems, like say there's competitors out there who have a similar product, I will look at the competitor stuff and see what has already been done so I can learn from what's already been designed. I also, I try to get access to those systems, and I also get access to the persons. We have an entire team dedicated to doing user personas. And what they do is they continually evolve these personas. We use those personas when we tell stories about what a user is going to accomplish. So the way I put myself in their shoes is I really just understand. I review those personas. Sometimes I'm involved in helping develop the personas. I do interviews with customers. So regularly every 2 weeks, we have what we call design studios, where we do customer interviews. And you can do that for any design. You just send out a screener that has some criteria. And it's like, you want this person who has this background, who has this kind of system, et cetera, et cetera. And then you get all these people signing up on your calendar, and you can go and sort of interview them, or you can do things like little mini studies with them, like card sorts or journey mapping exercises, prioritization exercises, all kinds of stuff.
Great. It sounds like that research process, however it takes whatever form it takes is kind of critical to that empathetic process you've talked about up to this point.
Absolutely. I would say that for where I'm working now, I'm at VMware and I'm designing stuff for administrators. And these guys work, we never see them. we rarely see our administrators. We rarely see the folks who are designing this, who are monitoring the systems that make everything work, like Zoom or our computers and so forth. They live in this like sort of isolated world. And so it's really, I have no way to relate to them. So I really have to listen and just sort of accept what they're saying at face value. I don't understand everything, but I just I feel like my job is to make sure that the product managers and the engineers understand who we're designing for. I do bring user quotes. Sometimes we'll even have sessions with the product managers and the engineers so that they can hear for themselves, because oftentimes it's a very natural thing to want to design for yourself, but we can't, right? I cannot be designing for myself. It's not for me. And frankly, these systems are so expensive. I would never be able to access these on my own. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you can do competitive research on apps and websites. I can't do that for enterprise because these systems are gated. So I have to really rely on the customer.
That's right. How does it feel that the industry is doing, particularly in enterprise? I think I'm really keyed in on this enterprise idea because when you and I spoke a few weeks ago and we learned about your role at VMware, you just mentioned it. The UX process can be a little clearer for things that have a clear end user or like an app or a web tool or something like that. At the enterprise level, how do you feel industry is doing utilizing UX talent? Are they utilizing UX talent to drive solutions? Is it coming in after the fact? Are you encouraged to engage in this sort of need finding process that you're describing here?
So as UX designers, I will say that this is something that's evolving across the industry. As a discipline, it's insane because I've actually been in for 20 years now, and it depends on the company, how mature their processes are. Sometimes they're a little bit more old school, sometimes not. It's almost entirely guys that I work with. They are across the world. We do have a little bit of diversity. We have a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but we're talking about 80 to 90% male, what we do is we're trying to get a seat at the table, not just as designers, but as people, as women, as people of color. Like, it's very difficult to just get a seat at the table. And when you have a VP of engineering and a VP of product design, look for companies that also have a VP of UX, executive level leadership and user experience. That's what makes it possible for us to properly do our jobs. I don't know if I answered your question.
You did. I think you mentioned that there's sort of an evolution taking place in the role of the UX professional. And where's that headed? Where does it feel like, what sort of emerging topics or philosophies are you identifying that emphasize the need to have a UX person at the table, maybe from the beginning?
So really understanding what problem are we solving for, that's the main thing. That's the most important thing. And sometimes what I've seen in many teams is that they rush to a solution and, the solution is about their grandma or about themselves or whatever. It's nothing to do with the end user. Not much research there. I mean, there are marketing departments. Sometimes marketing departments do that kind of research. Sometimes there's a research department. We are very fortunate that we have our own research within UX, and we have actual researchers who are trained in research doing this. It's very dangerous when we have people who don't have a research background doing research, because it discredits all of the research that's done and people start questioning it. So it's really important to have research in there so that when you do design, it's evidence-based and not just based on this feels good, this looks good. Everybody has an opinion about design because they can see it. And so people don't go into code the same way they do in design. They're not like, oh, you should have tried this method instead of that method. Like, people don't do that with engineers. So it is a little tougher as a designer. And the best way to combat that is to really come into
I think we've lost Deneva, or maybe she'll be back.
Short intermission.
Joel, maybe while we're waiting for Deneva to reconnect, maybe some of the things she talked about, I think, are things that our students think about a lot. Maybe you could talk about what you've noticed with the questions that happen in the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's easy from our standpoint to look at some of these, the exercises we go through building personas, the exercises we go through identifying the problems that our user groups face. And it's easy to look at these from an academic and sort of cut and dry standpoint. And I think what Deneva is offering us is an insight into how these are executed in industry. And furthermore, the challenges and the things that pop up when you're trying to execute these sort of academic ideas or theoretical ideas when it comes to things that you're actually going to launch, shipping products for people who represent truly diverse and expansive user groups. Ari, have you touched on personas in your classwork?
We did do a little bit of work with personas last time when I was designing the little app that we just made up. I made Designer Finder. We did do some persona work in that aspect where I was able to go out, kind of do user research and find out, who would be inclusive to my app and all that. Oh, I think Deneva got back.
Deneva's back.
Yeah, sorry about that. I came back on my phone because I wasn't sure if the computer, I don't know what's going on there. So anyway,
No
sorry
problem.
about that.
No, not at all. You were closing out, I think, a conversation about some of the emerging topics that you're identifying in, that UX professionals should be aware of. Do you have any final words to offer on that?
Accessibility. So accessibility is about including people with different abilities. So we're talking about designing for different bodies, different minds, different contexts. And so, all the designs that we do at VMware, we have an accessibility team, and we align with the US government standard for accessibility because we know that the people who are interfacing with our systems are going to be of all different kinds of backgrounds. And those backgrounds could mean people on the autism spectrum. It could mean people with ADHD. It could mean people who are not able to see or, have different levels of color blindness, typing, hearing, all sorts of different contexts and different bodies. So really being a good designer means that you're aware of those things. But I definitely think a company that's forward thinking is going to have a department dedicated to that and have UX design patterns. And those patterns should already have that built in. We have an entire team that just focuses on designing the patterns. And part of the criteria for those patterns is that they must be accessible.
So you mentioned a little bit about the government factors and the regulations that are at play when it comes to designing for accessibility. What insights can you offer us into what regulations and restrictions are out there, or just broad strokes?
So off the top of my head, I can't think of. There's if you Google this stuff, you will find that there are standards. There's Section 504. There's all sorts of. We have a disability accessibility specialist, Sherry. And she has a world of information. And I also included a book as one of my links in terms of education that has a lot of information in it about some of the standards. So as designers, it's tempting to just design something and make it work for only one person or based on what but there's so many other kinds of people out there that we don't necessarily know what their experiences are like. And so that's why we have design standards and why we have regulations. And now it's becoming a legal liability for companies. If you're designing something and it's interfacing with the public and the public are not able to access the service or the products or whatever it is that you're offering, that can be a lawsuit because it's discrimination. And that's, I know it's a kind of the way that I did the presentation earlier, it seems kind of loosely related, but it's actually directly related, because when we don't design to include people, that does set up companies for lawsuits. Even if it's something about privacy, as an example, the GDPR, we have to respect the privacy rules in Europe, and California has different privacy rules than the rest of the United States. So these are things that, people have asked for, they've fought for, they've gone and created legislation for. So we as designers must be aware of it, not only just from an ethics point of view, but from a legal point of view, because there are legal ramifications and social ramifications of the designs that we do.
Certainly. And you would think, even at the base level, there's product quality ramifications.
Yes.
And so it sort of speaks to the need to continue to include UX personnel from the beginning, people who are trained or deliberate about the empathetic process and designing not only for abilities but for identities and worldviews and backgrounds, the way people approach solving the problems they're solving.
Absolutely.
To that end, are there other prominent examples? So you shared the example of the Evolve logo. And it turned into No, which was great. A great example of, a design team who ended up, realizing who they were designing for and maybe adapting their product or the thing that they designed for that audience. Are there prominent examples of companies, maybe it's your team or teams out there who have clearly embraced these themes of inclusive design, or maybe, of examples of products or types of industries that may have succeeded or failed to embrace these ideals?
So we have our accessibility team, and they focus on making sure that people with all abilities are able to access the software that we're creating, right? So, whether they have low vision or whether it's, hearing or different, our body is just another interface, really. And we all have different interfaces. And so it's really important to be aware of those differences. But as a designer, it's really difficult for you to know everything, right, about everybody. We can't, right? So that's why it's important to have someone or a team dedicated to creating standards that we can align to. Like, we design stuff and it may look cool or it may seem like an interesting animation or interaction, but there's reasons why we don't do what, just because something is an interesting new technology does not mean that we're going to use that unless it's accessible to all the people that need to use it. Yeah, that's a point that I see as kind of a little bit difficult sometimes for newer designers, because it's, as in terms of creativity, it may feel like you're stifling creativity a little bit because it's like you want to do all these different things, but we also have to think about, well, who's using this? If they can't use it, it defeats the point, right?
Right. That's a great point.
Very well said. I have another question from a classmate of mine, Cameron Slocum. He asked, what progress have you seen in terms of inclusion in UX design? In what areas do you think there is still room for improvement?
So UX design is one aspect, and I happen to work in technology. I would say improvement would start with hiring. So some things that I see is that, like, at least in California, in the state of California, I'll use Black people as an example. It's about 5% Black, the entire state, right? So if we're trying to hire candidates who are coming from African ancestry, as an example, it's pretty difficult because there's not that many people here. So what has happened in the last year and a half with COVID is that companies have been more open to hiring outside of this area, right? So we can hire people in their communities rather than having them come to our community, if that makes sense. So there's pockets of the United States where we have different types of people, and different, everything. So when we stop hiring at only elite universities and hire across different universities, maybe even not hiring, we can hire people who even don't have a university degree and allow them to be trained up within the workplace. Those are things that make it more inclusive. Make it more diverse, but then that's diversity. That's not the same thing as inclusion. Inclusion is having a seat at the table. So UX design is a whole other level of having a seat at the table. So there's having the perspective of the entire, like our nation is diverse. Our world is diverse. The company that I work for is a global company, and I work with people in 4 countries every day, you know? So I have to have this ability to work with different people from different places. And we also need to hire people to have them included so that they're there to say something. Here's an example. I was at SIGGRAPH years ago, and I was in a 3D scanner, right? My hair was an afro at that time. And they're like, sure, you know, we'll scan you. But it couldn't scan my hair. It could only scan straight hair. Like it did a scan around my face. And I'm like, okay. And also with VR. VR is a good example. When you put on that headgear, you know, and if your hair is like taller or whatever, it's like, well, how are you supposed to wear the VR headset? Because these things are not necessarily being thought about by the people who are designing that hardware. So it's really important to have people who are different around them to be trying and using these things so that they are aware, you know, that maybe their stuff doesn't suit everyone.
Really great points. I feel everything that you brought up was something that I can relate to on a personal level, trying and testing out products. I have a big hair too, so sometimes I can't always use products or things the same as everyone else. We have another question from about representation in the UX world. How diverse is the UX field itself? In other words, is the hiring landscape in the UX world keeping up with the principles and inclusivity of universal design? I feel like you just touched on this, but if you have anything further to input, we would love to hear it.
I would say that kinda. It's kind of inclusive. It's not really, right? I'm the only Black person on my worldwide team. And we're like more than 300 designers. So my manager is the first female manager at our company. So just to, you know, I remember coming out of school thinking that I could just conquer the world, that these things about gender and race, they don't touch me. And I've been raised to believe that, you know, it's all in the past. Well, it's not in the past. And it's taken me like probably 15 years or so before I really started to feel the pinch of why am I not moving forward in this area or that area? You know, there's people tend to refer. Referrals are a program that's not the best because people tend to refer people they know. And for the most part, when we're hiring, we need to go outside of the circle of the people that we know if we want to have diverse candidates. We've brought it up multiple times at VMware and VMware is a company that makes inclusion at the forefront. It's not something that they just talk about, but they measure it. You know, they measure the difference between the pay between men and women. That's one of the reasons I chose to work there, is because I knew that I'm not going to be underpaid just because I'm a girl or because I'm, you know, of African descent. You know, these things are important to look at. Does the company just talk about stuff, or do they actually measure it and report on those statistics? If they're not reporting out on those stats, then it's just talk.
Great, thank you so much. We have actually a question from the YouTube panel. Christine Balestrini asked, can you speak on some of your own challenges in the design and tech field being a woman and a woman of color? And what advice do you offer for young designers today?
Okay, so some challenges I've had. I've definitely been called aggressive. I won't name the companies, but we're talking about some people have been working at companies for a very long time, you know, 20, 30, even 40 years, especially some of these bigger, well-established companies. And so they're not used to seeing, you know, a person like me making decisions or speaking up. A woman at all, first of all, and definitely not a Black woman, you know, and definitely not in technology. Even just walking around the neighborhood that I live in, people ask me if I live here because I don't look like I can afford to live here. There's things like that that I've come across. And so I've just had to basically embrace where I'm at. And as much as I am not always treated as though I belong, I know that I belong here. I know that I work in tech. I've been in tech for years. I'm at the center of tech, you know, Silicon Valley, and this is where I belong. And so what I try to do is I welcome other people. So when I see other folks who are different, I make sure that I say hi to that person. I make sure that that person recognizes or knows that they are seen. that they are heard. I am a good bystander in meetings and even in social outings outside of work. There was a time where, for example, I was with my friends and we had this guy who was doing archery and he was so sexist. He was making horrible, horrible jokes. And my friends were older than me. They were in their 50s and 60s. And so at the time when they're growing up, they didn't necessarily have the sense of, I mean, they know that it's not right, but it's almost like they've been conditioned to accept what's going on and not say anything. Whereas in my generation, I'm going to say something. I'm going to call it out and say that that was not okay. And, you know, set the boundary and the standard. This is sexist. This is not acceptable. I shouldn't be called a girl. You know, some people say, hey, girl. No, you know, I'm not here to make your lunch. You know, I'm not here to be in the kitchen. I design technology for systems worldwide.
Fantastic. It would seem that there's a practical incentive to fielding diverse design teams, right? So, you know, increasing the empathy on your team, increasing the perspectives, varying the worldviews, right? And that has to increase your ability to account for and intercept implicit biases that would manifest in the work, right? So would you assess assessing the UX field, would you say that a lack of representation would hurt the work or does hurt the work?
Oh,
or makes
totally.
it harder to produce good product?
Totally, absolutely. You know, especially if you're doing consumer facing design, you know, the example of, you know, the bathrooms, just not having female bathrooms at all in pubs for a long time because women weren't expected to leave the house. I mean, that's a problem. You know, it impedes the user experience. What else? Can you repeat the last part of what you said? Because there was something that you'd said that I wanted to.
I can't remember exactly what I said. I asked if a lack of representation in the UX field that you've been talking about is hurting the work, and is it impeding the ability of teams to identify and intercept and sort of cut out implicit bias before they launch a product?
I would say absolutely. The antidote to that is having teams that are diverse to begin with, and also having research. I believe in evidence-based design. Anything else to me is innovation, which is great. It's wonderful to do things. We don't know what's going to happen. We make experiments. That's totally fine. But evidence-based design is really where we should be looking. We should be looking at how do people actually respond to this?
Does that make for a big team? Or does it just make for a more focused team?
Knowing who you're designing for is really important. So every design isn't meant for every person, but different aspects of design are meant for different people. So if you're in government, you definitely have to be inclusive. You know, that's lawsuits. And even companies have to be inclusive because those are lawsuits just waiting to happen. Whether it's not including someone who's physically different, you know, has different physical abilities, or, you know, whether the schools, for example, like we have IEP programs and individual education programs in public schools. That's intended to make sure that people of all different types of brains are able to access the education. Every public service is going to need UX big time, and even private companies as well. It's not just UX though, it's the entire company, because UX as a discipline is just one piece of the product design. It's really, you need to have that across all of the teams. UX, usually there's one UX designer, you know, in a team of like 10 engineers. You know, I'll just say you got your front-end engineer, your back-end engineer, a product manager, a UX designer, maybe a technical writer or a copywriter, and maybe a visual designer, you know? And so usually there's only one UX person. So that person can't represent, they can't shoulder the burden of representing everything. That stuff needs to be built into the broader UX team. So the broader UX team, we've got accessibility experts. We've got people who are building personas and doing continual research. We've got people who on the product side are looking at the business. So it really is a whole company effort and not just limited to the UX team.
Is there progress as you look out 5-10 years at the what will become of the UX field? Are there signs of improvement and increasing representation and increasing the sort of crosstalk across the teams? representing worldviews and backgrounds more diversely. Is that coming? Does it feel like there's improvement afoot?
Well, I think when it comes to public services, it has to, especially when we're talking about paying our utility bills online or using our phones or accessing education services like public education. Anything that is public facing has to. And unfortunately, it does take lawsuits. It takes, protests. It takes fights and legislation to really change things. Once the law is in place, then we as designers and companies have to follow those laws to make sure that people can access whatever it is that we're offering. I think it's changing, but it's changing slowly. Mm-hmm. One case at a time. I'll say landmark cases.
I have a question. You mentioned what kinds of professionals serve on your teams usually. Can you talk more specifically on the roles that the various people play within the teams and how that is?
Well, I tend to work with everyone. Product manager first. The product manager is writing requirements. So there's a very broad variety of product managers. So they're all different. And the same thing is true with UX designers. Broad variety of different skill sets. So it's really important to know what their skill set is, what are their strengths, and be able to complement that. So I've worked with more junior people as well as senior people, and I've had to sort of fill in the blanks. So in terms of requirements gathering, as a designer, I use the direct contact I have with customers to help gather requirements. So I see what the product manager is asking. It's usually like, here, do this feature, whatever it is, right? It's something extremely specific. And then I go and I talk to the customer and they're like, well, here's a day in my life, And so the feature seems like huge to the product manager, but for the customer, it's just this tiny little thing in their world and they're trying to get something done. So I have to really find a balance between those things. With the engineers, they're the ones who make it happen. So it's really, really important to be able to understand how they think, to be able to communicate with them effectively, to show that you're listening, but also to stand your ground when you need to. It's very important because they can run you over. They do have engineers are held in high regard for obvious reasons. They make everything happen. But if they were able to do it all on their own, we wouldn't exist. We exist for a reason. We've had a lot of bizarre kind of, technology. It used to be okay to force people to get training, back in the day. If something was just poorly done, I don't want to say poorly done, but they did the minimum as it relates to the user interface and just made it work, right? And so then they hire teachers or trainers to train people to use the software. Software that is really, really well designed, you don't need training. That's an additional cost you don't need.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well said. You said it all. And my sister's actually an engineer for Disney. Quick little, and she told me about the aspect of working with designers and things like that, and how her team is heavily based within having to work with the designers, and it makes me really excited to be able to venture out and potentially make a career for myself in that field where I know that I can work with these brilliant minds and be able to create something that and of course our talents will build upon each other, and I think that's a really cool aspect. I'm just kind of seeing that in my classes right now when we do group projects, stuff like that, and I'm excited to venture out. We have another question asking, how would you characterize the difference between UX and UI as it shows up in the real world?
So UX is a series of events that have been designed to accomplish a goal. And UI is just the interface that you use to access that. So the UI is basically the buttons, if it's visual, like a graphical user interface or a voice user interface, there's so many different kinds of interfaces, but the interface is just the tool that you use to access the functionality, if that helps. Usually when there's UI designers, and UI designers are sometimes graphic designers, but they're often coders as well, front-end design, where they design things that the customer can see. The UX designer is the person before that, who's designing all the processes that happen that result in that interface. It's a collaboration between backend, understanding all the engineering constraints, as well as the abilities, because sometimes they'll have like something I think might be difficult to build. They'll be like, oh no, that's easy. And other stuff that I think is easy, they're like, that's going to take us a year. So really trying to work with the engineers, understand what the limitations are, and make sure that whatever you do is within the scope of that project is really important. UI designers often work closely with UX designers because we lay out how things are going to look and how the person is going to use it. And then the UI designer goes and makes it actually hook into the back end, if that makes sense.
Definitely.
Deneva, you mentioned, excuse me, Ari, go ahead.
No problem. No problem, you could go.
Mentioned at one point that I think earlier that you have teams that are dedicated to like patterns or component libraries or whatever you may call them. Is that what you're describing here? That you team up with UI and UX designers to create those patterns and then the engineers execute, or what does that team do?
So I'm at a very big company right now. It's not super big, but it's pretty big. So we have some mature processes. And so there's a whole team that's just dedicated to making patterns. So what they do is they figure out, what are the use cases, or we bring them the use cases, like different, people across the company will bring them use cases, like notifications is an example. How do we notify the user about X, Y, or Z? And where and how often and so forth. And when should we use this type of notification versus that type of notification? That's an example of a pattern that can be used across multiple different applications. There's a team that just focuses on that. And so what I do is I use these things that have already been vetted. That makes my job a lot easier. Now, earlier in my career, and also if you're working in a startup or smaller environments, they may not have these things set up for you, and you may have to do everything from scratch. So maybe there's no person there who specializes in accessibility. Maybe there's not a person there who's keeping track of all the designs so that we have consistency and are using the same design patterns. So you may have to found that from the ground up. That's a lot of work, but it can be done. But it is a lot of work. It makes my job a lot easier at VMware because basically whenever I'm doing a design, I see what do I need to do? And then I go into the library and see, well, what do we already have that supports these behaviors? I put them together. And if there's something that doesn't work, like say there's a design I'm trying to do and all these patterns don't work for that, I go back to the team that makes the patterns and I bring that to them and I ask them, are you guys working on anything? Because custom code is expensive, right? We don't want to have to build things that are brand new because it has to be tested, it has to be accessible, it has to pass all these regulations. So it's really important that we use what we already have. And if we have use cases that are not taken into account for the patterns that we have to just bring that to the table and say, hey, we need a new pattern for this. And you may end up being the person to design that pattern, but it still has to be vetted through accessibility and through the rest of the library.
It sounds like a really cool process.
Yeah, VMware is special. So, just so you know, it's not every company has this. I've taken me a long time. I very much deliberately chose to work at VMware because it has mature design and design has representation at even some of the highest levels of the company. So it's not like we're just defending why we exist, but we can do our jobs.
That's great.
That's great. I actually have a question for you. We emphasize soft skills a lot in DMD. What kind of skills do you need to have to be a successful UX designer, in your opinion?
So I would say storytelling is a very important skill. So the first thing is listening and observation. And if you have a researcher you're working with, they may have already performed that function for you. So you can just look and leverage the personas of the target users that you're working with and understand their user journeys. So that's the first point. That to me is the active listening part. In terms of the other skills, other soft skills that you need to be able to not just apply that active listening to your customers, but also to the engineers, to the product managers, and all the different people that you work with to understand what are their objectives. Because often, like, some of the stuff I'm working on now is going across multiple BUs, multiple business units. And it's not that I'm just working in one department. And these departments are silos. You know, it's really hard to get people to work together when they don't have the same objectives. And so it's really important to understand where people are coming from so that you can basically align and move forward, and making sure that we're moving the whole company forward and not just our own department. So I think being able to understand engineers, I feel like UX is kind of a facilitator and a translator in the middle. They're the middle spoke of a big wheel. And we talk to all these different kinds of people and we come up with designs. Yeah. Oh, other skills I want to touch on really quick. So some important skills are not just being able to know the story of your users and to be able to tell that to all these different people that you work with so that they also have that in their minds when they're creating requirements or, you know, doing the code, but also being able to stand your ground. So that's an important skill to have. So sometimes you'll be pushed or rushed to do a design without actually doing a real design process. And that sets you up for failure, you know, because in that sense, we're not designing for the user, we're just executing on requirements. And that's not where we want to be. We want to make sure that we include the user in the process, because otherwise we don't even know where we're going. That shows up, you know, the consequences of that are really coming down to the numbers when it comes to the company acquiring new users, making money, meeting their profit goals. We won't meet the needs. If we're not meeting the user's needs, then we're not going to make any money anyway. So it's really important to have users involved in that design process.
It sounds like
Really
the
great.
ability to advocate for the process and for your own, like you mentioned, your own existence as a UX professional is one of those important soft skills.
Yes.
One last question I believe we have, and this is really important to me as a young designer myself. I wanted to ask, what advice can you offer for young designers who want to get into the UX UI industry, and how do we prepare and what do we need to land that job, whether it's experience, portfolio, and any advice you have to offer is really great.
So I have a unique kind of background. So I was working as a consultant and as an employee, and right now I'm an employee, but I built up my portfolio by working for myself first. So I took on projects, things that I was passionate about. The first website design I did was in Toledo for the Juice 107.3 FM, something like that. I went and looked for projects and I did that, and I wasn't very expensive because I didn't know what I was doing. I was kind of learning as I was doing. And, you know, they were also getting a valuable service that they would otherwise have to get someone, you know, hiring a professional is not going to be cheap for a small company. So I think trying to get those projects, if you know people, network, get out there and meet people and learn how to interact with people. Another thing is within companies, if you can get internships, that's also helpful. Just being able to be in the office and see, or even on Zoom, and see what people are doing and observe and, you know, performing tasks that way. That's a good way to get started. Attending meetups, there's UX meetups, there's talks. Books are great, but I personally like talking with people, and I like attending inspirational workshops, things like that, where you can really get to be around other professionals who can lead you to other projects as well.
Really great advice. Thank you so much. And actually, it's kind of funny that like I'm actually speaking to you today because I last year before the pandemic began, I was actually in the works of trying to get an internship with VMware, and I spoke to Melissa. I don't know if you know Melissa out. I don't know if anyone knows, but yeah, I was like in the works of it, but then the pandemic happened and I couldn't spend any time over there. So hopefully in the future I'll get to go back and make those connections again. But
yeah, absolutely. We are always like, we have internship programs usually in the summertime, and there's throughout the year, you know, so there's definitely opportunities there. And we also have our SHAPE conference, other things that we do where designers and non-designers can come and participate and talk with each other and get to know each other.
That's so cool. I'll look into it. Thank you so much for that information.
Great. I think we'll be bringing Heather back in shortly. This has been some fantastic insight. Deneva, I could geek out on UX talk with you all day. I hope we get to connect again and discuss. And there's just so much to learn from you. Thank you so much. Anything you'd like to leave us with before Heather hops back in?
I would say, I can't remember who said this quote, but good design is like a refrigerator. When it's running, nobody notices, but when it's not good, boy, does it stink.
Excellent.
That's a good one.
That's a good one.
Oh, wow. This has just been such a great conversation. It's been wonderful being here in the background listening to this. And it's really great too, because I'm learning, you know, the thing that's great about us in design and in education is, you know, we learn from former students, we learn from our teaching, we learn from our everyday experiences. And it's been amazing to have, you know, Deneva here with us, who was my former student a gazillion years ago as well. So it's been just
Ari,
awesome.
we're going to call you back in 20 years.
That's right. That's right. Ari,
Hopefully, fingers crossed.
But thanks again. Thanks to Joel and Ari for hosting and doing such a great job moderating the conversation. And yeah, I think we have so many wonderful worlds of inspiration and insight that are going to help prepare our students for better careers in UX design. So, and we will definitely keep talking for sure, because I think more of this is always necessary. But anyway, everyone is invited back next week, Friday, April 9th at noon Eastern Time, when we welcome Sassy Seeley for the Diverse Perspectives Festival Spotlight on Lucky Grandma. This film synopsis is set in New York's Chinatown. An ornery, chain-smoking Chinese grandma goes all the way at the casino, landing herself on the wrong side of luck and in the middle of a gang war. So this is beautiful comedy drama that we'll be able to speak with the director about next week. And check out the whole rich lineup of our Diverse Perspectives in Digital Media and Design speaker series at dmd.uconn.edu/diverse. And don't forget to subscribe to us here on YouTube. You can check the playlist, all of the content we've had every Friday since February. You can check out there and watch any of those recorded content as well. And be sure to follow us on our social media channels at UConnDMD to see all of our students' great content. We're celebrating a lot of these seniors that are going out to get jobs and juniors that are getting internships right now on our social channels as well. Thanks to all the wizards and organizers behind the scene. Everyone helped to produce this great event. And most of all, thanks to everybody out there in the audience. We had over 30 viewers from around the country. So I hope you enjoyed it and you are leaving as inspired about the future of the industry as we are here in this Zoom room. So there is a lot of work to still be done. I think Deneva pointed on a lot of that, but if we continue to inspire and mentor our young creatives, hopefully we can make a difference and change this digital world out there for the better, to be more inclusive and more exciting. So anyway, thank you, stay safe, wear a mask, and have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye. All right, we're good. Yay, we're here.